We are live.
Hi, everyone. Good morning and welcome to day two of the CitSci conference. We're really happy to host this fourth edition of this very exciting conference. And I'm Anita Verghese. I'm one of the co-organizers, and I have the privilege and honor to introduce our keynote speakers today. They come from South Africa. It's an example of a work that I've known of for some years, and I'm very happy to have them here to talk and share about their experiences. I think it's very relevant to the work that we do in India too. So our speakers for today are Domitilla, Raimondo, and Suvarna Parbhoo. And Domitilla is the Threatened Species Program Manager at the South African National Biodiversity Institute, SANBI. She's responsible for the species assessments for South Africa's national biodiversity assessments. She has extensive experience in assessing threat status of South Africa's plants and animals, and she's the lead author of the Red List of South African Plants. She has coordinated several red list assessments. She's very dedicated to ensuring that species information feeds into land use decision making. She's also involved in species conservation work internationally through the IUCN Species Survival Commissions, and she's chair of the Plant Conservation Committee. She's passionate about mainstreaming species information into development work and works across Africa to ensure technical transfer and capacity development, which takes place to mobilize biodiversity information needed to inform decision making. Suvarna Parbhoo leads the Custodians of Rare and Endangered Wildflowers CREW citizen science program in South Africa, and she's interested in expanding the citizen science network and partnerships. Currently, she's co-chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission's Southern African Plant Specialist Group and chairs the Botanical Society Coastal Branch since 2017. She also assists with setting up the iNaturalist Southern African Citizen Science Community on behalf of SANBI. So on behalf of the conference organizers and the conference, I'd like to welcome both Domitilla and Suvarna, and we look forward to your talk and the discussions that follow. So over to the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Is it on full screen yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
Now it is.
Thank you so much. Good morning to you all. We are very privileged and honored to be giving you this keynote presentation on the work we've done on citizen science in South Africa. We will be focusing on plant monitoring and the work to involve citizens in plant monitoring, but Suvarna and myself do also work on animal species. So if there are any questions linked specifically to citizen science on animals, we can take that. As you heard from our introduction, we both work for the South African National Biodiversity Institute, and this institute is responsible for all biodiversity monitoring and reporting in our country. And yeah, we've both been involved in the work on citizen science for 20 years, running one particular program called the CREW program, which we will speak about extensively. But we'll also speak about other platforms such as iNaturalist that we use a lot in our citizen science work. Next slide, please. Okay, so in our talk, we're going to start off just telling you a little bit about South Africa's biodiversity, since I think some of you may not be familiar with it. And then we're going to explain the knowledge gaps that we've recognized and why we've started citizen science work. We're going to show you how we use extensively the iNaturalist online platform for our citizen science work. And then we're going to hone into our case study of this CREW program that we've been working on for 20 years, looking at how we specifically monitor threatened plants and how we feed that information into other conservation work. And we also involve our citizens in specific conservation projects such as in situ conservation. We'll have a focus on how we develop capacity of citizens, and then speak a little bit about the other conservation outcomes of the work, so where it feeds into. And then lastly, we'll end up on talking about how do we ensure inclusivity of all of our different citizens in our country in our citizen science work. So next slide, please. All right, let's start with our profile. So if you're not aware, South Africa is one of the mega diverse countries of the world, one of the 17, and we are highly rich in biodiversity. We have 3 global biodiversity hotspots. The blue one that you see there is on the eastern side of the country. It's called the Maputo-Pondoland Albany hotspot. It's grassland and forest areas, very rich in species. The green area is the Cape Floral region, which is one of the 6 plant kingdoms of the world, has many endemic plant families. And then the orange area is the succulent Karoo hotspot, which is an arid, semi-arid desert area. And we have high diversity of endemic succulent species and many insects and smaller animals that are endemic to that area. Okay, we are the 2nd highest country in plant diversity, and we have 6% of the world's plants, which is why our talk will focus on plants. Next slide, please. So we also are very fortunate in having incredibly high levels of endemism, so species that only occur in our country and nowhere else. And this map here shows the areas of the highest plant richness and diversity, and it's also the areas which are centers of plant endemism. So the darker the blue, the richer the areas. And you can just see it's around the edge of the country where we have a lot of endemics. And just remember this pattern for when Suvarna shows you where we've set up our citizen science groups later on. Next slide. Okay, so just as to start off, why did we start citizen science work? So between 2003 and 2009, we took on a very ambitious project to assess the conservation status, the red list status of do a red list assessment for every single plant in our country. We're still the only mega diverse country who's managed to get this right. It was an incredibly hard job. But in that process of doing a red list assessment for every species, we realized that we had a serious lack of information for the majority of our plants, and in particular restricted range and threatened species. We just had very little information. We had some herbarium records, but we had no idea of the population trends. We had no idea of the threats affecting the species. And also there was quite a lot of gaps in even knowing the distribution properly. And so as a result, we partnered with the South African National Biodiversity Institute, our institute, partnered with the Botanical Society of South Africa, which is an NGO, a membership-based NGO, to start a citizen science program in 2003 called CREW, Custodians of Rare and Endangered Wildflowers. And over the years, we've built up and brought in different volunteers from across the country, and we now have a network of over 1,000 volunteers who are strategically placed in areas where we have high levels of plant endemism and threat. And this network is providing amazing information on what's going on with the plants. So we've generated very accurate spatial data and population trend data that we use for red listing of our plants. Next slide, please. And so while we started the work for CREW in training our volunteers to use paper forms and going into the field with clipboards and forms, and then they would send them to us by email. They would scan it and send it to us. We've now transitioned completely over to the online platform called iNaturalist. I'm sure it's used extensively in India also. It's very user-friendly and easy to use, and it allows the taking of a photograph with mobile telephones, cellular phones and or good cameras, and then posting the information of what you've seen. It also allows different projects to be run, as you can see on the left-hand side there, just some of the projects from South Africa. Next slide, please, Suvarna. So it's been so valuable for us to use iNaturalist. We transitioned to iNaturalist in 2017, and this slide is just showing you how many records we've managed to obtain in this 6-year period. We've had just on plants, we've had over 2 million records, observations posted for plants in that time period for 20,244 species. Our total number of plant species is only 20,500. So most of the plant species in our country have been observed in the last 6 years. And to put this in context, our national herbarium, which is the biggest herbarium in Africa, has over a 200-year period managed to collect 2 million plant specimens. So in only 6 years, we have outnumbered the number of specimens that have been collected over 200 years. So it just shows you the power of these citizen science platforms and citizen science initiatives to gather really up-to-date and amazing information. Next slide. And the thing that we love most about iNaturalist is that you can actually have these bespoke projects that you develop. And we have developed projects to monitor species that are restricted range and threatened. We call them the red list of South African plants, the red list of South African animals. And you'll see on the right-hand side, there's the observation field where we ask for specific information of how big the population size is, and exactly what the threats are. And this is very, very helpful. So when we go to the actual stage of red listing, we can look up each record and say, oh, well, there were only 200 to 300 plants there, and the threats were invasive aliens, or the threats were development of a road, etc. So it's highly, highly useful. Next slide, please. So just as a specific example, this is a species that is used for tea. We make a tea called honeybush tea from it. It's delicious. But the whole genus occurs in our mountains, and you can't cultivate it, so you can only wild collect it. And some of the species are highly restricted. So this one we did list in the past as critically endangered because we only knew of a handful of populations, very small populations. And next animation, please. However, from the work on iNaturalist over the last 6 years, we've managed to gather so many more localities of where this plant actually occurs. So those green pointers show you where the plant occurs. And based on this, we've managed to downlist the species from critically endangered to vulnerable. So this is just one small example of how this information is gathered on the iNaturalist platform, and then we use it in our red listing. Next slide, please, Suvarna. Okay, so our institution, the National Biodiversity Institution, is responsible for a lot more than citizen science work. We have to do all the work from managing collections, so managing both plant collections and animal collections. We don't actually house animal collections. We work with other institutions and museums, etc., to coordinate the work on collections. But we have we have taxonomists. We do the collections, and then we have to do the scientific assessments on the status of the species as well as status of ecosystems, and then we build that all the way through into policy legislation and supporting our Ministry of Environment on various policy initiatives to protect species. So we have this diagram that you see there on the left, which is just showing how information goes from that foundational observation information through through up into science and policy action. Okay, so I'm just going to show you now how we use our citizen science work. So we have citizens across the country out in the field looking for species, in our example here, for plants, collecting specimens, taking pictures, posting on iNaturalist, and then allowing us to have very accurate spatial distribution information. And all of those records go into a database that you see there on the right-hand side. and then it's fed into a red list, so red list locality database, and then it's fed into the red list assessment process. And I manage the team that does the red list assessments, and there you can see a few of my colleagues doing the red list assessments. And from there, we're able to say what the status of all our different species are and use that information. Okay, thanks, Suvarna. So we produce something called the National Biodiversity Assessment. It's a big assessment on the status of all our biodiversity every 7 years. And this is where most of our assessment data go to. But then you'll see in the next slide that we also feed it very much into the different decision-making processes for the country. So we have 5,297 threatened or restricted range species, a highly restricted range. They have to have less than occur in an area of less than 2,000 kilometers squared. Those species that are threatened or very restricted range, we take that information and make sure it gets used. So the first is in spatial biodiversity planning, which identifies the area of the country where we do not want habitat to be lost. So you see in the map that Suvarna's just put in there, the dark green areas are our existing protected areas. And then the brighter green areas are areas that we've identified that we need to retain biodiversity in a completely natural condition and can't be converted to any other land uses. And then the sort of olive green color is areas where there can be land uses such as livestock grazing, but we need it in a semi-natural condition in order to maintain ecological function. So we have these detailed spatial maps. It gets done for each of our provinces or states. I'm not sure what you call them in India, and states, and then it feeds into legislated planning. So our plant information goes into that, and those bright green areas that we don't want to lose are identified based on where our special species are. We also then use it for protected area expansion. So where do we expand protected areas? Many of you should be aware of the new global targets now to protect 30% of the planet. And for South Africa, we've only protected 12% of our terrestrial area. So to get to 30% is a big step up. And we use our information that can come from our citizen scientists of exactly where these special species are to identify where we will expand protected areas. So again, in the map, the dark green is the existing protected areas, and then the purple areas are where we're actively working to expand protected areas, the pinky purple areas, and then the sort of darker tone of that is where our threatened plant work has directly fed into identifying where we must expand protected areas. Some of the other areas might be on targets of ecosystems. Okay, and next. And then I think most importantly, we use the information for environmental assessments, for environmental authorizations in the EIA process. So we've taken all of that data for those 5,000 species, and we have made accurate maps of exactly where each species are, and then it gets loaded into an online tool that for every developer, when they want to develop, they must put their development footprint onto this online tool, and it intersects what's actually there, what biodiversity is there, and all of our special species have their data there. And so when the developer puts their footprint there, it says, it makes a list that you can see there at the bottom of the species that are sensitive and need to be looked for in the EIA, and that mitigation needs to be included in the EIA. Otherwise, there will be a loss of those populations. So very clear guidance. We've also developed a detailed guidance of exactly how the consultants need to do the EIAs and how they need to what they need to recommend for decisions. So this is what we want you to take home from this, is what I think is unique in that we really ensure our citizen science information supports the conservation of species through the supporting of what decisions get made for every piece of land, and also for supporting where protected areas are established. Thanks. Next slide. I think now I'm going to hand over to Suvarna, and she's going to take you through the case study of our crew work, and the one where we've had this network of volunteers monitoring plants. She's going to tell you how we've done that. So over to you, Suvarna.
Sure. Thanks, Tilla. So crew citizen scientists play a unique role in carrying out a range of activities to provide valuable contributions to conservation, as Till just showed briefly. Their fundamental crew activity is recording plant taxa of conservation concern. Our ex situ work is in partnership with the botanical gardens and various other partners, whereby we prioritize species requiring restoration and recovery interventions. Crew supports biodiversity stewardship with site assessments and ongoing site surveys in both our private and communal owned land. And we will engage about what biodiversity stewardship is for expanding our protected areas a bit later. So looking at where the crew program operates, we have 3 teams comprising of 3 nodes: the Cape Floristic region in the Eastern Cape, as well as in the summer rainfall region. And these nodes are small teams of 2 people who provide support to our citizen science groups that are formed in the areas of high concentration of threatened plants, as illustrated in the background map. This map also then links to the map that Tilla had shown earlier in the presentation. So our crew nodes assign the species that the crew groups need to look for, and then assign them to the groups according to where they are based along the landscape. We also then annually host planning meetings with each of the groups to determine the taxa that they'll be serving for that particular field season. We've realized that our planning meetings are crucial in ensuring that our groups are kept focused and they are targeting specific species per field season. And this is how we get to the host of threatened species that we need to survey. So we've got over 5,200 highly threatened to near threatened plant species that requires monitoring. And over the 2 decades, we've surveyed a large percentage of these species as shown in this map, noting that some provinces are more species rich than others. We've also then focused on targeting the highly threatened species, so those in the threat categories critically endangered, and vulnerable, just because of the high risk of extinction. But also very key to notice the near threatened, so those not yet threatened, but will be soon facing or being assessed in a threat category. So we prioritize specific species, and then our critically rare and rare species are those species that mainly occur at high altitude, and they're not really threatened, but they just, as their status suggests, they're not seen often enough. And then we also focus on collecting information on species whereby there's not enough information. So the data deficiency that just has insufficient data because of taxonomic issues, as well as those that just haven't been collected in a long time. So there's quite a range of species that we prioritize serving each year in each of our different provinces. So looking at the crew projects, our major crew project is plant monitoring, and these activities comprise of regular target surveying of threatened species while ground truthing our historical records. We systematically target areas that have not been sampled yet and conduct intense sampling over a 2-year period to hopefully increase the species distribution records and distribution ranges over these undersampled areas. And then our critical habitat species are those with a highly restricted geographic range occurring in areas of less than 10 kilometers squared. Many of these taxa occur in hard-to-reach places and are sometimes taxonomically challenging to identify. We do have around 500 species that are within the critical habitat species, of which we've surveyed at least 220 species. On average, the crew program undertakes about 500 field trips across the network annually. This is an example of a site that we visited it's an undersampled area in the KwaZulu-Natal province. And in just a few hours, this small team has recorded 166 plant taxa, 9 of which were of conservation concern. And it goes to show just how much of effort is put in little time, and just getting people to hone into looking for specific things, as well as then surveying for every plant species that they find during a field trip. So we found very many new species to science. In fact, 18 new species, new plants have been found by the CREW program. And we work with taxonomists to then identify and write up descriptions for these species. And this slide just shows a few of the species, and some are obviously in prep. Looking at long lost species, so we've found over 70 plant taxa. We've actually rediscovered these taxa. And how do we rediscover? So these are plants that we thought were extinct, but because our citizen scientists undertake regular field surveys, they build their skills, not just on plant identification, but also looking at the changes in the veld. And looking at the habitat conditions, and sometimes post-fires is species that come up. So with this frequent monitoring, it provides an opportunity for a citizen scientist to get a feel of species that they haven't seen before, or something that looks new, and then we realize that, hey, it's a rediscovered species. So it's quite exciting for us to find these species that we thought were lost, and yes, quite an achievement when found. We are passionate about developing human capital across the program, and we have various initiatives in place. The first is hosting regular in-person meetings with all of our volunteers. So we host a workshop in both sides of the west coast of the country, as well as the east coast, just because our vegetation type and the work that we do is a bit different in the winter rainfall and the summer rainfall areas. And then with the pandemic, we've also started hosting quarterly online learning exchange workshops. And these workshops really assist in building botanical knowledge in the respective areas. We also then bring on conservation agencies, as well as scientists that would then share their knowledge with our volunteers, and it's really inspiring. Annually, we produce a comprehensive newsletter covering stories written by our citizen scientists about their activities over the year. But we also have researchers that would provide information about their current research happening, and asking for assistance on collecting specific species or collecting specimens for research. So we found that creating these newsletters, we share these online, as well as sometimes do print format. So we find that these activities motivate, inspire, and acknowledge our citizen scientists on an ongoing basis. So beyond the knowledge sharing workshops that we host, we also host plant identification workshops. And this is the biggest incentives that we find for our CREW citizen scientists. We also then provide training on herbarium techniques and protocol, how to take photographs, how to collect plant specimens, how to identify different soil types, habitat types, vegetation types, and more recently looking at online support. So we help with how to look at maps online and to make maps and just understand spatial data more easily, and also then a host of iNaturalist tutorials that are hosted throughout the year. In terms of working with learners, we conduct outreach with both learners at primary school and high school level. We host both summer and winter school programs, as well as celebrate various environmental important days. And our long-term goal is for our plant conservation resources to then link with school curriculum as we continue to work with our partners in the environmental education field. So here you can see that we do a host of field trips, but also like try not to use apps. So we try to split the activities that we do with just learning to be out in nature and appreciating nature and nature journaling, as well as then using the iNaturalist app. And it really captivates learners learning all sorts of different things, especially during the holidays. Looking at higher education institutes. So this began as a response to the scarce skill in the plant conservation sector. And the CREW program then began actively promoting inclusivity by engaging with a host of higher education institutes with a focus on previously disadvantaged campuses. The CREW engagement comprises of a lecture where we discuss red listing, plant conservation, iNaturalist tutorials, job opportunities, and where possible and where time permits, we even host a field trip whereby students learn about plant identification, how to take iNaturalist observations, as well as how to monitor species. And for some of these universities, we've been doing monitoring exercises over a long period of time now. So we found that this engagement has increased the number of internship applications from students interested in plant conservation. More students are doing postgraduate work in plant conservation, as well as an increase in the number of students who participate in our CREW groups field trips. So in their local areas, they're then starting to look at threatened species. We've been at least hosting one intern, sometimes a team of interns every year over the 2 decades that the CREW program has been running. And this internship opportunity has brought individuals into the plant conservation sector. Some were employed by the SANBI, and you'd see at the bottom, some of the faces are similar to the pictures that Tilla showed before on our Red List science work. As 2 of them have become Red List scientists, and others have become CREW volunteers. So where we find bright interns and we've got sufficient funding, we try to then bring them into the CREW program post-internship, and we just see these individuals flourishing in the plant conservation sector. And it's quite rewarding to then mentor these interns throughout their time in the careers. Over the past 5 years, CREW citizen scientists have been inspired to champion the Global City Nature Challenge and Great Southern BioBlitz events in their respective areas by conducting intensive surveying in target areas for the 4-day period. Our citizen scientists have also been instrumental in identifying the thousands of plant observations that are made during the 4-day event. And apart from this being a fun activity whereby members of the public start participating and looking at nature in their immediate environment, these events have become an opportunity for us to not only recruit citizen scientists to monitor species, but also to target undersampled areas, survey for our threatened species, and also because sometimes it's out of our typical field season, we're also then able to look for long lost species and be out in the field at times when we're not normally at our highest peak of field trips. So this infographic shows some of the threatened species that were surveyed during the City Nature Challenge earlier this year. Again, this was out of our field season. And it was quite rewarding to see the number of threatened species observed. And we've also then recognized our citizen scientists who had the most number of observations, as well as who has done the most number of identifications during that event. And that's no easy feast. Over to you, Tilla.
Thank you. So I'm going to round off our talk, just taking us back to how we do more than just monitoring information for scientific purposes, for red list assessments, but how we actually also directly support on the ground conservation. And the first example is through how we support the expansion of protected areas, but through a model that we have in South Africa called biodiversity stewardship, where either private or community-owned land gets contracted into the National Protected Area estate. And this process requires you to get the landowners, communal or private landowners, on board, convince them to conserve their biodiversity, and then there's like a 3 to 4 year process of working with them to develop a management plan for the site and to get the title deed registered to be a conservation area. So it's quite a process. We do this. Our citizen scientists work very closely with the stewardship programs in each of the different provinces or states, and we work with either the NGOs active there or with the government agencies, depending on who takes the lead in that particular province. And what we do is we go out and survey loads of different areas, identify the most important places for stewardship to take place, and then once it's decided that there will be a stewardship site there, we do inventories of which species are there and look at if there are threatened species there, which normally there are because we have very little resources, so we tend to focus in on the very important sites. With the threatened species, we link that into what management is required to ensure that piece of nature stays in a good condition. Okay, next slide. So we've worked in each of the different provinces, land parcel by land parcel, hand in hand with the stewardship programs, and Crew's really been fundamental to the success of this work, which has happened over 20 years. We've been doing stewardship for around 17 or 18 years. So that's the one thing. The next slide, please. Oh, sorry, just go back there a moment, Suvarna. So I just want to mention that, back a slide, there you go, is that we now use the iNaturalist platform again while we're doing the stewardship work for each piece of land. All the species are posted on iNaturalist, and it's really lovely for the landowner because they can get a beautiful summary of which species are there with all the photographs, etc. Thanks. Next one. Okay, so the next conservation initiative I want to speak through is which species are on the brink of extinction and need urgent recovery. And we've taken all of our threatened plants, those 5,267 that we showed earlier, all of those, and looked at which ones are the highest priority to do recovery work based on their red list criteria. So if they are only at one location and the population is declining really fast, if they're fewer than 200 individuals, etc. So then those become the priorities because they're on the brink of extinction. We showed 2 examples at the bottom. The yellow funny ugly daisy is we thought to be extinct. We found 3 remaining wild plants, but we've had plants luckily in ex situ and managed to reintroduce, and we're doing a whole project to reintroduce and restore its habitat. And then the little protea with the butterfly on it has dropped from over 1,500 individuals in the late 1990s to only 2 individuals left in the wild. And again, we're doing extensive reintroduction work to try to save the species. So we've got 356 of these species that are on the brink of extinction, and a huge amount of work needs to go into these. And our volunteers can help us to monitor, and in some cases also help us to actually manage and do the ex situ conservation. The next slide, please. So just one very specific example is that we are currently experiencing a huge problem with illegal wildlife trade, targeting our succulent plants, these dwarf succulents, these tiny little species like this big. You can see 2 examples on the right, have become very popular for ornamental trade, especially in China, Korea, and other countries in the East. And suddenly, since 2019, we've had an explosion of illegal collection of these species. We have close 11 species that are now functionally extinct in the wild because of collection, but 586 that we found from confiscation. So that, you know, there's successful law enforcement efforts, confiscate the plants, and then these ones are brought to our botanic gardens and need to be managed and looked after and reintroduced if possible. So our citizen scientists have been incredible because they have volunteered to come into our botanic gardens, help sort out all these confiscated plants, help us plant them into trays, help us collect seed from the individuals that are on the confiscations. And that's incredibly important because we need to collect as much genetic diversity as possible for restoration work. So they've been amazing, and we're so overrun by these hundreds of plants that are being illegally collected that we're not managing with our paid employees at SANBI, and we really need the help of our citizen scientists. Next slide, please. Now I just want to speak a little bit about measures to ensure inclusivity. So it's, you know, in what we tend to find with citizen science work, it's all voluntary. It tends to be then only those of an economic bracket that are able to volunteer their time or have the resources to also drive around, who can do it for free. So we've thought about a lot of ways of making sure that all different South Africans are able to participate. We've run programs specifically over the funded by our national government called Groensebenze, which means green work programs, and we've employed many young individuals across the country, paying them a constant stipend to go and monitor plants, and then also done extensive training of how to collect specimens, etc. You can see the picture there on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. The other thing to ensure inclusivity is really making sure that our citizen science work is done in a technologically easy and friendly way. So the use of iNaturalist and using cell phones, which almost all citizens have, is a really great way of promoting inclusivity. And then we also do a lot of training on how to do the work as Suvarna showed earlier, and that really does inspire people to take part because they build their own skills, which can be useful for them in other areas of their work. We do things like cover travel costs, etc., for those who don't have the resources to pay. But even with the cost of fuel these days, we do it for most of our volunteers. We cover fuel costs, and then we do things like buy data for our citizen scientists, especially young South Africans who don't have a lot of money. We buy data so that they can use that to post their information on iNaturalist. And then the last thing we do to ensure inclusivity is making sure that we can communicate effectively with citizens of different ethnic groups who speak different languages. And so we have in our team people who speak all the different South African languages and who are able to communicate appropriately. And there you see my colleague in the blue at the bottom. There's me with a team, with a whole group of herbalists working on medicinal plant monitoring, and then my colleague is translating into isiXhosa, which is the language there. So we are ensuring that the work we do, we have people who can speak the appropriate languages. Okay, but just still to be clear that many of our citizen scientists are retirees of different race groups. But the retirees do tend to be the ones who have the time available. So we have a lot of youngsters at university stage and then a lot of retirees. Okay, now my last slide. Thanks, Suvarna. So just elements of success, and we want to just finish with that. The first is funding, and it's been, we've managed to secure, we started off with small project funding for 3 years, then managed to secure a little bit of government funding, partnered with an NGO, and then had brought in small funding all the way along. But we've managed to get through the partnership with the NGO, a long-term philanthropic funder, which has been amazing for us, and the Mapula Trust. But having secure funding and a little bit of government support has made a big difference. But only about 30% of our work is funded by government. Next. Then the people, dedicated leadership to this project. We have the same team. Look at me, I've been here for 22 years, and then Suvarna for 18 years. So most of our team have been with us for a long time, but very dedicated leadership scattered across the country, and building the depth of people, doing a lot of mentoring, a lot of internships, as Suvarna showed, and then connecting with a range of stakeholders, our NGOs, conservation agencies, and developing those relationships so that we ensure our citizen scientists' efforts actually feed more broadly into conservation. And then the last slide. And then I think the most important thing for us is that we make sure that the data collected by citizen scientists is very relevant to our government, to our priorities to conserve species and do sustainable use. And so we showed you examples right up front of how our data gets fed in, but ensuring that there's a pathway for that data to go to has been critical. So keeping information relevant is fundamental. And that's it from us. And we hope you enjoyed it, and we're open to any questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Suvarna and Domitilla. That was such a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. And every time I see some of the plants out here in the Nilgiris, I know where they've come from. And I know that they've probably been smuggled in through some, from a long time. I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to, if in the interest of time, we may have just 10 minutes. Is that okay, Akshata, if I take 10 minutes for the questions?
Yeah, sure. Anita, you can go ahead.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to just, ask some of the questions that there's some fantastic questions out there. And, one thing that people were asking was, regarding IDing of plants, because that's really the key when you come to, having, what should I say, research level data or, data that can be used for any kind of quantitative work. So how do you get that kind of data? And the community of expert identifiers, does that mean citizen scientists with the required knowledge or actual professional scientists? So maybe if you want to answer that, and then we can go to the next question.
Yes. Okay. So that's a really important question. And so when we started with this program 20 years ago, the general public were not very good at identifying plants, right? So and we have 20,000 and 11,000 endemics and many restricted things, so very, very difficult. So we purposely chose those groups across the country. We helped provide guidance on how to identify the special species. So we made little identification guides, but we also linked them with specialist taxonomists to identify. But over the years, that network have become experts themselves, because they have been working now for 20 years, and now they're all on iNaturalist, and they help each other to identify. So we now have an extensive base of plant experts that are not only our employed taxonomists, but that has been through the dedication of over time, building the capacity and the learning. And as Suvarna showed, we've run so many courses on how to identify specific groups of plants. So that's how we've built that. So it's moved from only experts helping to identify to now a broader group. And on iNaturalist, it's a Wikipedia, like a crowdsourcing identification. But ours are really pretty good because we have so many trained citizens. But we still have experts on iNaturalist helping us. So with the really tricky groups, they tell exactly what must be photographed, which kind of stipules and bracts, etc., need to be on the picture in order to be able to properly identify. And so that's also one of the things that we do to help get accurate identifications, is guide what to take close-up images of. And some things still need specimens sent, and we make sure that happens. Thanks.
Yeah. So then maybe this question, Suvarna, because some of our, participants are very interested in this idea that you've been holding a group together for 20 years, So how does that happen? How do you stay, keep them engaged, keep them interested? I think you mentioned a little bit about it. So I think one of the questions was, do you have established protocols that you give new joinees? Many people who run citizen science programs feel tired because volunteer turnover is high. And, you have to start from the very beginning when somebody you've trained has left.
Yeah, thank you. So we do have an operations guide, which we've compiled for new citizen scientists. And so how we get them into, so there's different models, and that is why I showed the different activities for plant monitoring. So we change things around when we're doing our field trips. Some trips would be to new and exciting sites that people haven't looked at before, and some will be looking at those specific species. And we also then know which are the hard to find species and then the easy targets. So we'll give a mixture of targets. And then we also have students joining in the established groups. So as the retired person is getting older, here comes a student just bringing in a spark of interest, or even other citizen scientists. So once you have a new citizen scientist, you now have to train and have that mix of new and old, and that also then inspires and keeps people ticking on. But it's just having different projects. So iNaturalist has been great at having new people join, but just keeping the spark of different projects. Thanks.
Yeah, I remember visiting your offices and I found the energy in that whole place quite infective. So I think it's a great team that you have out there. A question about SAMBI. Is SAMBI a government organization or an NGO?
We are a parastatal government institution. So we're an entity of the Ministry of Environment Affairs. But we are allowed to raise a lot of our own funding, which we do. So in some ways we operate like an NGO because we bring in our own funding, but we still have a core amount of resources that come from government. And in this particular project, we have 3 core staff paid for by government. But at any time, we normally have around 10 to 12 individuals working on the project across the country. And much of those salaries come from what money we've raised from NGOs and from one. We've been lucky to have one philanthropic donor the whole way through. Well, not the whole way, since 2009.
If you're not too tired because you've been talking for so long, there are 2 more questions. And so there's one which is about how do you keep the data about locations opaque in ensuring sufficient opaqueness to protect species. I think you touched a little bit about it, but maybe if you can just explain a bit more.
Yeah, Suvarna, I think I should take that.
Yeah.
Yeah, or not? You can go.
All right. So we've got a list of threatened species that are highly collectible, so like our succulents, our cycad species, and we've blocked all of these. So we've sent those localities and those species actually to iNaturalist, together with evidence of why we wanted these observations or these species to be blocked. So on iNaturalist, even if you don't know what the species is, you upload it, and as soon as it's identified, the location's obscured. We did have questions around people trying to look at where a person would have surveyed other observations and tried to locate the protected species, but it is quite a rather long, daunting experience. And we do tell our citizen scientists, rather we know of the location, than not knowing, and then it goes extinct. So there's various measures in place on iNat. And then even with SAMBI sharing data, obviously with being government, we have to have open source information. But there again, we've got levels of obscurity and hidden information within our data sets that's open to the public.
That's great. And Tilla, do you want to add a bit more, or you good with that?
No, that's perfect. It's just that we have an official sensitive species list that is then like, it's around 580 species that gets sent to iNaturalist, and then we keep on updating that so somebody can motivate, or you don't know that this is a sensitive species, or suddenly something gets included in a confiscation and we're like, oh wow, we didn't know that was popular, so we quickly add it to the sensitive species list, and then that goes into the backbone on iNaturalist and it gets blocked, but also in all of the other ways that we serve our information, as Suvarna mentioned.
A last question, regarding the support that you give to volunteers, covering travel costs. And I think somebody was just asking, how do you cover cost of the volunteers for their travel to field sites and things like that? Do you?
Yeah,
You do.
so yes, we do, but it's an incentive that we hide for our most prized volunteers. So the more active volunteers obviously would get these incentives. And then we also work with students working in specific areas. So it's a mix. And how we do it. So with students who's using public transport, then we sort of give them an advance. So they write a motivation, we give the advance, and then they would provide a slip to say we've used public transport and this is the cost, and then provide us with evidence of how many iNaturalist observations they've made. So we know we can track just how much of value we've got out of that funding. And then for volunteers with their own vehicles, we then pay mileage costs as illustrated by government standards. So there's protocols that government has, and then I would just calculate kilometers and then pay for mileage costs like that. We also sometimes would pay for accommodation where possible, where there's a big group, we know it's an undersampled area, so then we'd pay for that accommodation, and people can then just go to sample those sites.
Yeah, so I think, I think this, it's been a great introduction to so many of our participants about the fantastic work you do. And I think the linking of this kind of a citizen science work to action, to conservation action, and to influence policy, I think that's really something that we should take home from here. Thanks so much for your time. I know it's been very early morning for you. Thank you for taking out time to do this. And I hope that we'll have more opportunities to interact and to work together. Yeah. So with that, I want to say thank you to all the participants out there. Thank you for being here and joining us. And Akshita, if there is some last minute things, is there something you want to take up before we close the session?
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Domitilla and Suvarna. That was wonderful. And we have a lot of comments back on Discord. So I see the both of you are already on Discord. So maybe after the session, you'd want to take a moment to address those questions and comments. Thank you so much. Thank you. It was really wonderful.
Bye-bye. Thank you.